Morning, Glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Greetings to my 450 affiliates across the country and anyone listening on HughHewitt.com. Special treat. New guest. Brand new guest. 2 months ago, BV, before the virus hit home. A friend at the last dinner party we probably will hold for months and months and months took me aside and said, whatever you do, you must read Dominion by Tom Holland. I said, who's Tom Holland? He said, well, he's a great British historian, and he's on the BBC. How do you not know? And I said, well, because I don't live in the UK, and I don't listen to the BBC, but I'll read it. Magnificent book. Absorbed it by listening to it. Got in touch with Tom Holland via the Twitter world, and you can follow him at Holland_Tom, and he joins me now. Good morning, Tom Holland. Where do we find you today?
You find me in London that is under lockdown, much like I know much of your country is as well. It's a strange time.
It's an interesting time in which to talk about Dominion because your book is full of plagues and acts of heroism and terrible suffering. But tell us first a little bit about Tom Holland. My audience always likes to know the story behind our regular guests, and I hope you will become one.
Okay, well, I've got to make clear first of all that I'm not Spider-Man. In fact, Spider-Man has ruined my life. People always assume that I'm Spider-Man. Unfortunately, I'm not. I am a historian. I began writing about Rome. The first book I wrote actually was against the backdrop of 9/11 and the build-up to the Iraq War. And it was a portrait of the fall of the Roman Republic that I kind of cast as a mirror held up to the United States. And then over the course of writing about antiquity, it began to worry me just how strange and distant and alien the Romans were, much more than I thought when I began writing about them. And it led me to ask, well, why is that? And so my most recent book, Dominion, is an attempt to explain that. And basically, to sum the answer up in a few short words, my answer is that what separates us from the world of antiquity, from the world of ancient Rome, is basically Christianity. Christianity changes pretty much everything.
My friend Steve Thames, with whom I've been friends for 30 years, very brilliant lawyer, took me aside. He is a believer like I am, a very devout Christian, and I don't hold myself out as devout, but I believe. Took me aside and said, this is the most influential book I've read about Christianity, and I don't know what Tom Holland actually believes, but I know he knows the story of Christianity. Bottom line question, did your views on the truthfulness of the Christian claims change as you wrote Dominion?
Well, what I came to realize was I was brought up a Christian and then kind of essentially lost my faith as a child, basically because, first of all, I found dinosaurs more exciting, and then I found the Romans more exciting. And so I essentially devoted my life to the Romans. But because I began to find them so frightening, I began to realize that in cultural terms, in moral terms, in ethical terms, I'm completely Christian. And I also began to realize that lots of things that I had taken for granted as a kind of agnostic, things like human rights, things like the assumption that all human beings are created equal and have a dignity, these are essentially theological notions. These are notions that are as unfounded in hard reality as Christian convictions. And I guess where I am now is I feel that the experience of writing the book has educated me in just how rich and profound and mythically potent Christianity is. And I feel myself much more open to a sense of its potency and power. Whether that will translate into an actual belief in God, I don't know. But I'm on a journey, let's say that. I'm on a pilgrimage.
You know, I'm sure you know the C.S. Lewis story, also a Don like you, and eventually just knelt down and surrendered. We'll see. It is my great joy on this show over the years to have had Christopher Hitchens on 50 times before he died. All those interviews collected at hughandhitch.com. To have had Richard Dawkins on and have him mock me. Said, you really believe Christ turned water into wine? In fact, I want to play that little bit for you, Tom Holland.
Okay, do you believe Jesus turned water into wine?
Yes.
You seriously do?
Yes.
You actually think that Jesus got water and made all those molecules turn into wine?
Yes.
My God.
Yes.
Okay.
My God, actually, not yours.
So we had a very fun, spirited conversation, but that.
Hugh, he said there, "Your God, not mine." Actually, I think Richard Dawkins is a very, very Christian figure, or rather, rephrase that, he's a very Protestant figure. Because why is he so obsessed with bringing people, as he sees it, out of darkness into light? Why is he so obsessed with battling superstition? Why is he so obsessed with overturning idols as he sees it? What he's doing there is behaving like a Protestant reformer in the Reformation. And,
yes.
and again, he's drawing from that tradition on traditions that go back to the beginnings of Christianity, the missionaries going into the dank forests of Saxony and chopping down the oaks that were sacred before. And they, again, in turn, are drawing on traditions that go back to the Hebrew prophets, to Isaiah and Jeremiah. So Richard Dawkins, it's justified, I think, to call him an evangelist, because he is absolutely following in the footsteps of all those previous evangelists who thought that they were bringing the people who walked in darkness into light.
Yeah, and Hitch was the same way. Hitch was a personal friend. I don't know Dawkins, but they all are evangelists, and Hitch was, and they have trouble with truth claims. I'm not going to press you on the truth claims that Christianity makes. I want to talk about your book. N.T. Wright and I have talked a great deal about, we spent 3 hours once talking about Paul, when N.T. Wright wrote about Paul. You spent a lot of time on Paul, and the claim that he is a transformative figure for world history simply cannot be denied, Tom Holland.
I think that Paul is quite possibly the most influential writer who's ever existed in terms of the impact that his writings have had relative to how much he wrote. I grew up convinced that it was the great writers of the classical world who had changed everything, Plato and Aristotle and Caesar and people like that. But essentially, Dominion is a monument to my recognition that I got that completely wrong, that it's those letters, and basically there are 7 letters that all scholars accept are written by Paul. It's like every single line is a kind of acorn from which enormous oaks over the course of 2,000 years have sprung. And there's almost no aspect of Western society that in some way has not been profoundly shaped by Paul, whether it's our attitude to law, the way that society should be organized, the way that we conduct sexual relations, the way that we structure marriage. Almost every aspect goes back to Paul.
I'm going to structure this interview by simply queuing you up to give a few vignettes because of the things that stuck with me. I listened to Dominion, and I recommend to everyone, listen to Dominion and read Rubicon, because Rubicon is not familiar to you. You need to read it over and over again. Dominion is like music you heard when you were young, but recast and covered by a new band, and it's better. And so that's why I'm going to run it this way, and I'm going to do it roughly in the order in which they occurred to me after I was done listening to the book, Tom Holland. First, I want to talk about Martin of Tours, because I didn't know any. I'm a good Catholic boy. All right, 12 years of parochial education before Harvard, before Michigan Law School. It's deep, as Dianne Feinstein once said, the faith is deep in that one. But I had never heard of Martin of Tours. What an amazing guy.
Yeah, an incredible guy. So he's a guy who lives in the 4th century A.D. He's a soldier, a Roman soldier serving in the army. Becomes a Christian, is standing sentry duty in a city in deep winter. He is there on his horse, on his thick military cloak, and he sees a starving beggar at the gates. And so, thinking of what Christ had taught him, he takes his cloak and halves it with his sword and hands it over to the beggar. That night, Martin has a vision. Christ comes to him, and essentially Christ says, "I was that beggar." And Martin is then feels called to serve Jesus not as a soldier but as a hermit. So he stands up to the emperor and says, "I'm leaving military service." He becomes essentially a conscientious objector, and he's a kind of hairy, smelly guy. He's not a guy from the silken aristocracy that at the time are running Gaul. And when he gets elected bishop, he is a kind of countercultural figure. But it's precisely the fact that he is countercultural, that he, in a sense, is challenging all the assumptions of the aristocracy of the day, but gives him, in the eyes of those who admire him, this incredible spiritual power. And after he dies, his tomb becomes a great place of pilgrimage. It's the tomb that when the Arabs come to Spain, they launch a great raid to try and capture it, and they get blocked by the Franks, and it's a kind of great turning point in European history. But also what then weirdly happens is that Martin becomes a kind of token of the French monarchy, and the cloak in Latin is capella, and a capella becomes the word for the chapel, and for chaplains kind of guarded. And the French end up manufacturing a kind of regal lineage for him, an aristocratic lineage, because they don't want to think that he's from the slums. And in the end, that means that he becomes the object of revolutionary hatred in the revolution, despite the fact that actually he's basically the seedbed from which the French Revolution emerges. The idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The idea that aristocrats should be challenged. Martin is kind of the embodiment of that, and it's an absolutely typical paradox of Christian history.
I love the fact that you then square the circle. The sacking of Martinopolis, as Martin of Tours' shrine became an object of the French revolutionary fervor. It surprised me when you returned to the subject deep into Dominion that the Revos had to go and tear it all down, even though he was the embodiment of egalitarianism, right?
Absolutely. Well, the French, the revolutionaries called themselves sans-culottes, and culottes are the kind of stylish breeches that the aristocrats wear, and that the poor only had kind of rags. And basically, you could say that Martin was the original sans-culotte, ripping off his cloak and handing it over to the beggar. And that's the power. That's really what I'm interested in Dominion, is the way that things that might seem to contradict Christianity and often be very hostile to Christianity, in fact, are drawing on impulses that are deep buried in the Christian past. So the American Revolution, the idea that all human beings are created equal, this is not remotely a self-evident truth at all. The French Revolution, the idea that there are human rights as a fundamental, again, this is not at all self-evident. The idea that there are human rights, again, is a deeply Christian one. It emerges in the 12th century with monks and scholars in medieval Europe.
Yeah,
the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution, what's the Russian Revolution about? The Russian Revolution is founded on two principles: the idea that the first should be last and the last should be first, and the idea that there will be a kind of universal paradise which spans the entire world at the end of time. And both of these ideas are nothing if not Christian. They would not exist without Christianity.
There is also in church history, I lingered a long time on Hildebrand, Gregory the Seventh, because as a Catholic, I think my denomination is deeply in need of a Gregory the Seventh to come and cleanse it of the scourge of the abuse scandals. He started what you call Reformio. And I began to think of every reforming movement might have its origins in Gregory the Seventh's call to reform.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that it's entirely legitimate to think of Christianity as the greatest kind of cultural, moral, ethical revolution in history, but it takes on a particular form in Western Europe and then ultimately the whole of the West. And the foundational figure is this Pope, Gregory VII, in the 11th century that no one has heard of. Everyone's heard of, Lenin or Luther, but people have not heard of Gregory VII. And I think the reason for that is precisely that he was so successful. It's the revolutions that are completely successful that people forget about.
Oh, well
put. Take it for granted. And what Gregory does is essentially he takes the idea that every Christian accepts, that you can be cleansed of your sins, that you can be born again, that you can be baptized, and he applies it to the whole of society. And he says that we can cleanse all of society, we can reform it. He uses this Latin word reformatio, which of course will reappear in the Reformation. And he is so committed to this idea that he's prepared to challenge anyone who stands in its way, including emperors, including kings. And he makes the emperor, the heir of Augustus and Constantine and Charlemagne, kneel in the snow outside the castle where he's staying. Staggering things, absolutely stupefying. And so really it's the first experience of revolution that Europe has. And it sets Europe on a really culturally distinctive path that, of course, in due course, the United States will become the heir of. And it embeds ideas that things can be progressive, that law can be progressive, that society can be improved. All of these ideas, again, are not remotely given. These are products of this remarkable period of cultural upheaval that you get in the 11th century. And really, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the American and French Revolutions, the 60s, all of them are simply kind of further turnings of this revolutionary wheel.
And I'm going to read much more deeply in Gregory, and it is my Catholic prayer that we get one at the next convocation. May it be far away. Francis is a good figure for this time. Right now, it's become apparent to me that it's a time of suffering, and he's a pope for this time. Let me move forward to a person I had never heard of, Tom Holland. Johann Streck, a Jesuit in the court of the empire in Beijing, who had sworn an oath to the Pope, who had clinked glasses with Galileo. I'm just amazed. How do I not know this? How do we not know that China got the Jesuits and the Jesuits got their astronomy department? And how do we not know this?
It is an amazing story that the Jesuits reached China and reached Beijing. There's this remarkable figure, an Italian called Matteo Ricci, who gets there at the end of the 16th century and ends up basically a kind of Mandarin, an official Mandarin, with a Chinese name, Chinese robes in the heart of the empire. But the thing that's fascinating about the role that the Jesuits play in China is that they are able to give the Chinese emperor and the Mandarinates thing that Chinese scholars can't, which is a very accurate understanding of when eclipses are going to happen. And the reason that they're able to do this is that one of the strange things about Christianity that perhaps people may find unexpected, I certainly did when I began to think about it, is that often the idea that there's something called religion and something called science and that these are opposed is quite a popular idea. It's something that Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens are both very keen on. In fact, science, the idea of science, the category of science emerges from Christianity, and it emerges from it because what Christianity gives is the idea that there's a single explanation that embraces the whole of the universe, but also that the God who has organized and created and structured this universe is willing to be bound by laws himself. So in the Bible, in the Old Testament, he's bound by the covenant which he joins with the children of Israel. And in the New Testament, the new covenant that Paul speaks of, the covenant that has been brought about by Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And what that means is that over the course of the Middle Ages, scholars start to think, well, if God has created the entire universe and he has laid down laws, then we can understand those laws. We can fathom those laws. So Galileo is the heir of this assumption, and the Jesuits are the heirs of this assumption. And there is absolutely no tension whatsoever between Christian faith and between the amazing breakthroughs in astronomy.
In fact, I want to celebrate your treatment of Galileo is revolutionary in that you fully flesh him out as a celebrity-minded, fame-hungry, gifted scientist moving among the court of Urban. I've never read this story, but I heard this story before. I'm running along. I was listening to it running and saying, I thought of poor Galileo locked in a jail or house arrest or whatever it is.
No, it's all a myth.
It's a myth.
It's a complete myth. And again, it's the great myth of the Enlightenment, the idea that Galileo was somehow, tortured or executed or whatever by the evil papacy because he wanted to prove the truth about science. None of this is remotely true. And Galileo couldn't prove what he was saying. He had no hard proof that the Earth went round the sun. And so the Inquisition said, well, give us the proof, and then that's fine. But if you can't give the proof, then, we're just going to stick with the consensus. And the consensus was, at the time, that the sun went round the Earth. So that's basically what it was about. But Galileo was as you say, basically a kind of, he was fame hungry. He wanted to make a splash, and so he ignored this. And this was at a time when the Catholic world and the Protestant world were meeting in the terrible conflict known as the 30 Years' War in Germany. And the papacy in Rome was anxious that things were going badly for the Catholics and that maybe Protestants would spill across the Alps and menace Rome. So it was a dangerous time for Galileo to be doing this. He was forced into silence, but he was not tortured. He was not locked up in prison. But the idea of him as a kind of persecuted martyr for science and liberty originally began as Protestant propaganda. And then it got taken over by the Enlightenment thinkers, and now it's basically passed into the bloodstream. But the thing is that the Enlightenment and whatever you want to call it, people who are convinced that science has all the answers and things like that, they have myths just as much as Christians do, because they are themselves products of Christian assumptions, by and large.
And Dominion does pay due finely from the perspective of a serious historian to this very complicated, iterative dialectic between Christianity and science. I just thought it was wonderful. I want to skip now. I don't want to abuse your time. I hope you start. By the way, in this period of plague, are you doing any live streams, Tom Holland? People would just swarm to watch you talk about Dominion, Rubicon, Islam. They would just tune in and watch you talk. Are you doing any of that?
I haven't been, but you encouraged me to think that perhaps I should be.
Oh, I think people would take an hour of Tom Holland every day just lecturing. You'd be overwhelmed.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so, and I might take that hint up.
All right, now
we're all stuck in the house, so why not?
Right, why not? And so now I want to move to the execution of Charles. Interestingly enough, as I was listening to Dominion, I was reading for the first time, even though I'm sort of old, I finally got round to Copperfield. And of course, Charles lives in Mr. Dick's head in Copperfield. And here he is being executed in your book. And that's a turning point. Cromwell is a turning point. I never quite got this, that Cromwell, he embodies that Christian Reformation. It is remarkable what he embodies.
Well, Cromwell embodies a kind of a radical form of Protestantism,
yes,
which is essentially the conviction that what matters is not so much what the church tells you, that's kind of very much the Catholic idea, but specifically what the Bible tells you, but not just the hard words on the page. It's what the Spirit motivates you to understand about the words on the page. And that then means, in turn, the implication is that everyone should be free to follow their own truth. And this is the kind of revolutionary idea that is starting to germinate certainly in England in the middle of the 17th century, and also in the Dutch Republic on the other side of the North Sea. And England and the Dutch Republic, between them, start to germinate this idea that truth is a kind of enlightenment that is imprinted on the heart. And if you want to know the truth, you look into your heart, and that light will then kind of show you what you should do. Now, obviously, this is highly contested and shaded about by all kinds of ambivalences, because, as a Catholic, I'm sure the one thing that you know about Cromwell...
an Irish Catholic. Irish Catholic.
Yeah, okay, so an Irish Catholic. So you know that Cromwell leads this very bloody invasion of Ireland and leads kind of all kinds of slaughter. But in England, he is oddly a voice of toleration. He sponsors this idea that that people should not be persecuted for what they believe and that they should be free to believe in what they want. And I think that explains a huge part of the tension between the way that, say, the English and the Irish traditionally have tended to view Cromwell. But Cromwell and the Dutch as well at the same time, these are people who are really blazing a path that will catch fire in America.
Well, this is why Dominion matters so much.
The Atlantic world, yes, and it plays I think that in a way the most interesting, certainly the most significant role that this sense that you don't need specific things in the Bible to know what God wants is demonstrated in what will become the great campaign against slavery. Because notoriously there is nothing in the Bible that explicitly says that slavery as an institution is evil.
Right.
But because you have this idea that the Spirit illumines you and lets you know what is right, what happens over the course of the late 17th and then through the 18th century is that initially Quakers and then evangelicals, both in America and in Britain,
there are two ways.
Absolute conclusion that slavery must be abolished.
And it's detailed extirpation history is here. But there are two ways that books influence people. Ian Forster said, you're being influenced when you say, I might have written that if I just had a little more time. But there's also the more influential book that changes your understanding of a figure or an event. Now, my understanding of Cromwell is shaped by my Irish Catholicism. He's a hated figure in Ireland for good reason. But I also was in Westminster Abbey one day staring at his tomb, and a little old lady came up to me and said, he's not there. They dug him up. And I didn't know that. And I always thought, okay, evil man. In fact, he is the first I've taught con law for 25 years, Tom Holland, and a First Amendment seminar on religious liberty and free exercise for 20 years. I never would have put Cromwell down as a prime mover of Jeffersonian separation of church and state and religious liberty. And yet you prove up the case that he is.
This, I think, is what is so fascinating about the history of Christianity, is that it's essentially a kind of great Moebius strip of paradoxes. I don't know if you ever read Douglas Adams' comic, not science fiction novel, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And in that, there's a spaceship that is powered by paradox. And I think that Christianity is basically like that. It's been powered through time, across space, by paradox. And the idea of Cromwell, the butcher of Drogheda, being a godfather of religious liberty is just one of the many, many paradoxes. And of course, the greatest paradox of all is embodied in the foundational symbol of Christianity, the cross, which is an emblem of imperial power, of the right of the Roman state to torture to death anyone who opposes it, of the right of the master to torture to death the slave. And yet it's become the symbol of exactly the opposite of that, of the triumph of the weak over the strong. And essentially, that is what has changed the world. But it's also what makes tracking the process by which that change happens so difficult to do, because, as I say, it does throw up paradoxes and ambivalences of exactly the kind that you fixed on.
You also illustrate anecdotes are evidence of anecdotes, not of history. But by putting enough together, you illustrate this pattern. Another one, the Right Honorable Company in Sati in India. Here we have Christianity imposing upon a subcontinent both the very idea that they are involved in a religion. That had never occurred to me, that was a Christian imposition on the world. And then reforming the religion that it is recognized to exist. It's extraordinary.
Yes, well, this is something that really I'd begun to think of writing about antiquity. And you get books that say about, the ancient Greek religion or the religion of the Romans. And I began to think, actually, the Romans didn't really have something called religion, because what do we mean by religion? We mean something that's kind of, it's what you believe. So you say, what's your religion? What do you believe in? But also we have this idea that religion is something that exists separate to what we call the secular. So we assume that, again, that this is just something that everybody has, but they don't. Not even in the Middle Ages did they have it. What the revolution that Gregory VII is pushing through, he's saying that there are twin dimensions: the dimension of what he calls the cyclum, and the cyclum is the limit of human memory. So it's things that are in flux, things that come and go and are borne away into oblivion. And then he says there's the dimension of eternity, the dimension of the city of God, the dimension of heaven. And the only way that people can win heaven is through the bond, the religio in Latin, that the church provides. And so Gregory enshrines in his Revolution the idea that there are two dimensions, that of the cyclum and that of the religio. And by the 18th century, these ideas have become, in English, the secular and religion. And the idea that there is a space where, say, the British go to India and they're only there really to make money. They're not there to convert people or anything. They're there to make cash. And they say, this is the secular. We're not going to tread on the religion of what they call the Hindus, the people of Hindustan. But of course, the Hindus don't have a religion because it's an entirely Christian concept.
Yes.
And so the British start saying, okay, so what's the religion of the Hindus? What is Hinduism? And they construct something that basically is patterned on Christianity, which in due course, people in India then start to think, we belong to something called Hinduism. We have something called religion. And in the book, I quote an Indian scholar who brilliantly says, Christianization happens in two ways. It happens through conversion, which is obvious. I mean, everyone can see that. But it also happens through secularization. And what he means by that is that the very idea of there being something called the secular and something called religion, and that these are separate spheres, is a Christian one. And that therefore, although Turkey or India or Japan are obviously not Christian countries, the fact that they're defined in their constitutions as secular means that to that degree they've been Christianized. And it's an incredible thought.
It's an amazing story. I've got to end, and I want to end because and most Americans in my American audience will say, well, talk about the Pilgrims, talk about Ben Franklin. It's all in there, William Penn, but I'm going to talk about someone they don't know that I did not know about until I listened to Dominion, Edward Drinker Cope. And I'm going to do so because for me, he embodies the problem in America and in free world today dealing with Christianity. They are all tormented by Cope's Darwinian crisis. And I've never found it to be a crisis at all. It's never complicated my faith in the least. But if you would tell the story of this poor man tormented by the Judith River with nightmares of the dinosaurs he had found and why it ought really not to be a problem.
Well, I've basically, I'm aware I may have given the impression that I think everything comes from Christianity. I think most things in the West do, but I think Darwinism is the first great kind of intellectual upheaval that does contradict Christianity, because the idea that, and although it's not Darwin's phrase, that the fittest survive, the idea that those who are weak or those who are ill are going to fall by the wayside. This is kind of contradictory to the way that Christianity is certainly understood by a Quaker like Edward Drinker Cope, who comes from Philadelphia in the mid-19th century and is a passionate paleontologist. And in the 1870s and the 1880s, as the West is being opened up, he goes out into Wyoming and Montana prospecting for dinosaurs. And he actually kind of narrowly avoids Sioux warbands in the aftermath of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And he gets engaged in this great kind of conflict with a rival scientist from Yale, basically to try and get as many dinosaurs as they can. But for Cope, Darwin's theory is profoundly upsetting because as a Quaker, he's profoundly committed to the idea that the strong have a duty of care to the weak, and that absolutely those who are in prison, those who are suffering, those who are absolutely the bottom rung of society need to be cared for, need to be looked after. But he seems to have found that that these ideas were unsettled by Darwinism and also unsettled, therefore, by what he was discovering in the fossil fields of Montana. And so the dinosaurs start to haunt his nightmares. And in due course, he leaves the Society of Friends. He loses his faith. And I think it's a very powerful story.
It is.
I think Cope is a kind of embodiment of a path that many people have taken, and indeed one that I myself took, because as I said at the beginning of this interview, I was one of those children who was obsessed by dinosaurs, and so that's how I first came across Cope. And in a way, I sympathize deeply with the path that he ended up taking.
Well, Cope is Dawkins. Cope is my friend Hitch. Cope is everyone
Yes.
tormented by the idea that science makes faith impossible, but I think you square that circle.
Yes, but what Cope does that I think Dawkins doesn't do is that Cope is honest enough to recognize that Darwinism unsettles the moral principles that he had taken for granted.
Oh, true.
I think that a problem with many atheists is that they just assume that the moral inheritance of Christianity that they're taking for granted is just kind of out there, that there's no need to debate it. Absolutely, there's a need to debate it, because if Christianity is not true, then the moral, ethical assumptions that it upholds aren't true either, necessarily.
My whole life is, as Paul said,
and
my life is a waste if it's not true. It just doesn't make a sense if it's not true. Let me close, Tom Holland, with a plea that you do consider just start broadcasting from Holland Studios in the Holland House, but also one big out-of-the-box question. Why did Sulla fail and Gregory VII succeed?
I think they succeeded because to a degree, they were pushing at an open door. I think the idea had been seeded over 1,000 years of Christian faith that it was possible for the individual to improve him or herself, for the world to be better, for progress to be made. And what Gregory does is to essentially apply that to the dimension of the whole of Christendom. And it's a kind of revolutionary moment, because from that moment on, nobody who's born into a Western culture has been able to forget that possibility. The idea that we can make society better, that over the course of each year, our law, our society, our culture can improve, is one that we've never got rid of.
And what I didn't mention, he did that in the middle of a plague, did he not?
That's Gregory the First, Gregory the Great.
Well, that's what happens when you listen to a book. Tell me about Christianity in times of plague. Tell me about that.
Well, it's interesting. You asked me, have I been doing any broadcasts? I did do one broadcast. I did a kind of sermon for a church called St. Bartholomew's here in London, which is the oldest standing church in London. And we were celebrating St. Cuthbert's Day, and St. Cuthbert was a Northumbrian saint in the northeast of England in the 7th century. A wonderful man who very close to animals, very close to angels.
Carried about forever, right?
Figure. Yeah. And I was asked by the rector of St. Bartholomew's to give a talk about him, which I was going to do on his day, on his feast day, which is the 20th of March. But that had to be cancelled because of the coronavirus. So I did it from my house. I recorded the sermon in my house, put it up on YouTube, and it got integrated into a service that was broadcast from St. Bartholomew. So this is a church that's been standing in London since the 12th century. And I listened to the stream of it, and it was just the rector and a couple of people singing, just 3 people. And I found it incredibly moving, because it reminded me of something that had happened to the biographer of St. Cuthbert, again back in Northumbria in the 7th century, a man called Bede, who became the first great historian of England. And he has this account of a plague that hit his monastery when he was a boy and killed everybody apart from the abbot and Bede himself. And they went through and did the church services every day as they were required to do, surrounded by the dead of all the monks who had died in the plague. And Bede himself knew that the reason that the English had become Christian was because missionaries had been sent from Rome by a man called Gregory I, Gregory the Great. And Gregory had brought Rome out of a terrible plague. So you know the great castle by the Vatican,
yes.
the Vatican,
Yes.
And it has a statue of an angel on the top sheathing a sword. That angel is St. Michael. And the story goes that everyone in Rome is dying of the plague. Gregory I leads a procession, begging God for mercy, and he looks up and he sees St. Michael on that castle, and Michael sheathes his sword as a sign that the plague will be over. But this is just obviously a story. Gregory knew that the question of why does a good God allow innocent people to die of plague, kind of lies at it's the knotty heart that lies at the heart of the paradoxes of Christianity. And so Gregory wrote a commentary on the book of the Bible that perhaps most potently, most existentially poses this question, which is the book of Job. And Job loses his family, loses his possessions, and then suffers, he suffers boils and suffers a terrible plague, lies in the ashes for 7 days, and then asks this question: why do good people suffer awful things? And in a sense, there isn't really an answer to that goes beyond faith that God is good and that all will ultimately be well. But I think what the book of Job illustrates is that any notion that Christians and before them the Jews had not, were not well aware of this issue and not kind of haunted by it is ridiculous. It in a way lies at the heart of the Christian story, as it does of the Jewish story as well.
Your meditation on the book of Job is, I think, instrumental. Your history of the church and dominion, necessary for people who are at home. And Tom Holland, much success to you. I hope you do open up Holland at home. Maybe the BBC will get smart and carry Holland at home for the duration of the crisis. Well done. I hope you will come back.
I would love to come back, and thanks so much for having me.
Tom Holland.
All your listeners well in these difficult times.
Follow him on Twitter at Holland_Tom. Go and get Dominion. My recommendation is listen to it. It's just charming. Thank you, Tom.